Part 1. Laying the Foundation. A high-level look. Defining your niche. You are holding this book, so you either already know or you are about to find out that the language services industry is a complex and dynamic environment. Specific demands originate with the LSBs, and in time, specialized services are developed by entrepreneurial-minded companies to meet these demands. This is one of the reasons the language services industry is so fragmented. It would be impossible for any one company to meet all of these demands on their own. The largest players in the industry, too, aren't able to do this, and they rely heavily on their supply chain to supplement their own services. A diagram on page shows the definition of the word niche, with the first definition being a recess in a wall, especially for a statue, or something such as a sheltered or private space that resembles a recess in a wall. The second definition is more appropriate for our discussion here, and it lists a place, employment, status, or activity for which a person or thing is best fitted, such as finally found her niche. Next, a habitat supplying the factors necessary for the existence of an organism or species. Next, the ecological role of an organism in a community, especially in regard to food consumption. And lastly, a specialized market. Moving on from this diagram. In this environment, there is a lot of opportunity for new or growing LSPs who are able to successfully carve out a niche for themselves. By specializing in a certain area that is in demand, they can lock themselves into a guaranteed revenue stream. See more on niches above. If you are currently already working in the language services industry, then your company may have a very specific niche. If so, then the examples used in this book and the stories we tell may not relate to your experience 100%. Now let's look at the key players in the industry and how they interact with each other in the language services value chain. Language services buyers, LSBs, and language services consumers, LSCs. We will start our discussion at the top of the language services value chain by looking at the buyers and consumers of the language services. We make a distinction between LSBs and LSCs. The LSB is the ultimate purchaser of the language services, and the LSC, as the name suggests, is the ultimate consumer. We don't need to spend much time talking about LSCs because it is a relatively simple concept. In today's global economy, LSCs make up roughly all of the GDP of all of the global economies. In other words, we are all LSCs. You, us, the guy next door, the guy who sold you this book, your marriage counselor, everybody. Unless you are living off the grid deep in Appalachia, subsisting on creek water and squirrel meat with a social life that consists of drawing faces on pine cones and hosting imaginary tea parties, I guarantee that you have consumed the end product of the language services industry. Language services providers and contract language professionals. Many have heard the term LSP before. It stands for Language Services Provider, or Localization Service Provider, depending on whom you ask. Generally speaking, this term will apply to any company in the language services value chain that adds value either through directly providing language services or by managing vendors of language services. The generic term LSP includes everything from a one-person translation company to a global multiple language services provider, MLSP, employing thousands. For the purposes of the discussions that follow in this book, though, it is necessary to draw a distinction between the different classes of LSPs that evolved in the industry. In the past decades, we have seen translation companies grow from small regional agencies to large multinational enterprises, giving birth to the massive multiple language services providers, or MMLSP. Much like the rise of the dinosaurs at the beginning of the Mesozoic era, this phenomenon did not happen overnight. Aren't you impressed with our dinosaur knowledge? Back in the early days when Renato was inscribing his translations on stone tablets, LSBs would typically work directly with translators by hiring them internally or engaging them directly as freelancers or contracted language professionals. Just like with the dinosaurs, though, a slow evolution occurred. Over time, some of these CLPs evolved into single language services providers, or SLSPs, which evolved into regional multiple language services providers, or RMLSPs, or multiple language services providers, and eventually into the massive multiple language services provider, the Tyrannosaurus Rex of the localization kingdom. Evolution doesn't occur autonomously. It is shaped by changes in the environment. The evolution from CLP to MLSP was driven by the changing demands of the customer and the external market influencers. In our example, the MLSP represents the end result of this process and is therefore the most evolved, but is no more important than any other players in the industry. It may seem like the king of the jungle, but it is only one player in a delicate ecosystem that is heavily dependent on the other players. Figure 6, a probable evolution path for LSPs. In Figure 6, we see the classic debunked evolution diagram showing man's evolution from chimp walking on all fours up to modern man, with a comparison drawn between the evolution from contracted language professional, single language service provider, regional multiple language service provider, multiple language services provider, and massive multiple language services provider. It should be noted, though, that when looking at this diagram, it is not meant to denote that any one of these is less or more evolved than the other. As the previous paragraph notes, each one of these plays a crucial part in the ecosystem. Moving on from Figure 6. Figure 6 not only represents how LSPs have evolved as a species over the years, but also represents the typical path that a company may take as it grows in the industry. That is, if it is able to stay in business and not get bought by a third party. So let's take a look at our typical value chain to examine the role of different classes of LSPs and see how they interact with each other. We will start at the bottom with CLPs and work our way up to MLSPs. We frame the discussion this way so that we can see how one can grow out of the other, with the natural evolution from CLP to SLSP to RMLSP to MLSP to MMLSP. Contract Language Professionals, CLPs. The CLP is arguably the most important player in the entire industry. This category consists of any individual contributor in the value chain, but is primarily made up of translators, proofreaders, copywriters, marketing professionals, consultants, and engineers. It's basically anybody who has the skill and expertise to adapt content to global markets and is willing to sell their services. CLPs are the backbone of the language services industry. Without these unsung heroes, no work would get done. There are many different types of CLPs in the industry today, but generally speaking, there are some common traits among them. Many choose to work on freelance or short-term contract basis because it allows them the flexibility to set their own schedule, be their own boss, and have control over their work-life balance. On the other hand, some do choose to seek full or part-time employment from language services providers, and in some rare cases, they work directly for language services buyers. Those who freelance set their own prices and reserve the right to choose what they work on and when they work on it. Many enjoy working as a CLP because it gives them the ability to work on multiple projects for multiple different clients. Thus, there is always something new and exciting to work on. As we mentioned, it is increasingly rare to see CLPs working directly for LSPs. LSBs used to contract directly with CLPs before the existence of LSPs, but over time, LSBs' demands increased. LSBs began to require more complex services such as project management and engineering, which was outside of the scope of most translation CLPs. So the industry evolved to meet these needs. Some CLPs chose to remain as individual contractors. Others chose to grow alongside with their clients into SLSPs. A comic strip on this page shows a cartoon depiction of author Renato Beninatto saying, "Are you a freelancer? All you need is a website and a business name, and you can update your business card to CEO." Moving on. The topics discussed throughout this book will be valuable to any CLP. If you are a CLP who is passionate about your work and enjoy the freedom that comes from freelance work, this book helps you better understand the larger marketplace in which you are operating. It gives you the knowledge and confidence you need to work for more interesting clients and make more money doing it. If you are interested in growing your business into an SLSP or single language service provider, or into an MLSP or multiple language service provider model, this book can help you with that too. Single language services providers, SLSPs. Imagine you are a freelance translator working directly with a hot new computing company back in 1980. This promising new client of yours seemed to be growing rapidly and soon has much more content than you can handle. You could A, try to translate faster yourself, or B, hire some junior translators to increase your capacity. If you choose option B, you then add a percentage to the rate that you are charging the client, and eventually you have a team of 20 translators working for you and are making a profit from the business without having translated a single word yourself. This is exactly how the first SLSPs came on the scene, and it was all in response to changing, increasing client need. SLSPs constitute the bulk of all translation agencies in the world, assuming, of course, that we are including one-person operations, which are basically CLPs with a business license and better branding. This is largely because it is one of the most sustainable business models in the industry. It is a happy medium between the risk of being an independent CLP and the overhead of managing dozens of languages like an MLSP does. It is with this in mind that we decided that a lot of the data and ideas presented in this book will be directly relevant to SLSPs, both large and small, new and old. Regional Multiple Language Service Providers, RMLSPs. Some SLSPs are not content with one language. There is more money to be made by offering multiple languages, and LSBs were all too happy to let their suppliers provide even more languages for them. The incremental cost of adding additional languages are minimal in the grand scheme of things, especially if you are operating in a market with multiple language requirements and therefore have easy access to translators for other languages. A figure on this page lists what RMLSPs do. Mostly operate in countries like India, where multiple languages are spoken, or deal with geographical clusters such as the Balkan or Baltic languages. Specialize in lesser-known or lower-demand languages, such as indigenous African languages. Specialize in different dialects of the same language, such as different variants of Latin American Spanish. Virtual RMLSPs specialize in different dialects of a language from different regions, such as Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese, French and French Canadian. Moving on. RMLSPs came on the scene as soon as the technology and infrastructure was available to support such a business model. For example, 20 years ago, with the continually decreasing cost of travel and international communications via long-distance telephone services, a Brazilian SLSP providing Portuguese translations could grow to provide Spanish translations with relative ease. In Europe, the fall of the USSR meant that some Eastern European SLSPs could expand into additional Eastern and Central European languages, thus multiplying their service offerings. The RMLSP still exists today and is still a viable business model. These companies can add a lot of value, whether they are engaging with MLSPs or directly with LSBs, particularly in areas where there are multiple regional languages spoken or if they are specialized in rare languages. An MLSP would much rather contract with a single RMLSP in Southeast Asia, for example, than have to find separate vendors for each of the dozens of regional languages. RMLSPs can operate in regions with obscure or hard-to-source languages. They carve out a niche for themselves and add value through their vendor management core function. There are even some LSBs who prefer to contract directly with RMLSPs, either because they are strategically focusing only on a single region for global expansion, or because they enjoy the reduced costs associated with cutting out the middleman that is the regular multiple language services provider. However, mostly RMLSPs will actually contract with the MLSP to perform their work, which gives them a steady and predictable flow of work without the overhead of having to actively acquire new LSB clients and maintain those relationships directly. For RMLSPs, the information in this book is useful to understand a little more about the larger ecosystem in which they operate, as well as the specific value that they bring to the language services value chain. Specialized RMLSPs are a very important cog in the larger machinery of the language services industry. Multiple language services providers. RMLSPs are technically MLSPs with an additional letter in front of the acronym. For the purposes of this book, though, we draw a distinction between RMLSPs and MLSPs as they operate in different niches in the industry and often have different customers. This is to say, they are both MLSPs, but they rarely compete directly with each other. In fact, MLSPs are RMLSPs' biggest customers. MLSPs oftentimes grow out of SLSPs or RMLSPs as they continue to offer more and more languages to their clients. However, it is equally common for MLSPs to start from scratch, completely skipping over the SLSP and the RMLSP stage. As we discussed later, there is really no barrier to entry into this industry, and anybody with a computer and a willing customer can become an MLSP from scratch. The key distinguisher between MLSPs and other LSPs is that more and more LSBs are almost universally deciding to work exclusively with MLSPs, rather than either with smaller LSPs or directly with translators. This is part of the larger trend in the industry over the years that has moved translation from local to global. Decades ago, if you needed translations, you would pick up the phone book to find a company. Almost without exception, these companies were small and specialized in one language. The Yellow Pages were the LSP's best marketing tool. Hundreds of companies like AAA, Spanish Translation Agency, or Zero Errors French Translations, with the numerical depiction of zero being used rather than it being spelled out, dominated the advertisements, each trying to stake a claim on that coveted first slot in the alphabetically listed directory. All this changed with the advancements in technology and lowering of barriers to global business. International phone lines, fax machines, then the World Wide Web and email. All these led to the natural and inevitable emergence of companies that could offer not only multiple languages from their regions, but from countries all over the world. For an Argentinian LSP, it was suddenly just as easy to hire a Chinese translator as to hire a Spanish translator. This brought more value to the end client because it meant that they did not need to manage as many vendors and could instead engage with a single vendor who could handle all their localization needs. Thus, the MLSP was born. One characteristic of a typical MLSP is that they work with dozens of languages that are not confined to any geographical area. In fact, most MLSPs will not even have a set list of languages that they work with because they understand that by maintaining a structured and flexible vendor management program, they can effectively source any language required by their clients. Their typical answer to a client asking about which languages they offer is simply, depends. Which languages do you need? Another characteristic of an MLSP is that they work almost exclusively with LSBs. They rarely sell their services to other LSPs or any other players within the industry. Even though MLSPs are at the top of the language services value chain, it doesn't necessarily mean they are always the biggest players in the industry. There's absolutely such a thing as a one-person MLSP. This is why we draw a distinction between an MLSP and an MMLSP, that is, Massive Multiple Language Services Provider. MMLSPs are simply very large MLSPs. You would probably appreciate a more exact definition here, but we aren't going to give it to you. The absolute truth of the matter is that any distinction we draw would, at the end of the day, be entirely arbitrary. We could say MMLSPs are over X dollars in revenue or employ Y number of employees, but such a definition doesn't add value to our conversation here. Why? Because in the language services industry, size does not matter. Size is just a state of mind, and when LSPs start to define themselves by their current size, they are unconsciously limiting their potential. So our distinction between MLSPs and MMLSPs is only meant as a useful descriptor that we can use to frame the discussions in the rest of this book. Regardless of size, MLSPs play a very important role in the language services value chain. They are the gatekeepers to the entire services industry. 9 times out of 10, when an LSB approaches the industry for language services, they approach an MLSP. Throughout this book, we use many examples to illustrate different concepts, and a disproportionate amount of these examples focus on the MLSP. This is chiefly because the MLSP is the player in the industry that has both a relationship with the LSB, the end customer, as well as all the other players from RMLSPs to SLSPs and CLPs. Therefore, it is very useful to use MLSPs as examples when illustrating points that take the entire language services value chain into account. Language Technology Providers, LTPs. Language technology providers, LTPs, provide technical support that allows other types of service providers to do their jobs more efficiently. These LTPs are largely outside of the discussions of this book, but are an important part of the ecosystem and therefore deserve a mention here. Language technology is constantly evolving and improving, and LTPs play an important role in this process. Undoubtedly, changing technology is one of the most important market influencers in the industry. However, in this book, we are going to refrain from diving too deep into the different types of language technology that are driving this change, because our attempt here is to write a book that is general enough to be useful to everyone. If we were to include a current analysis of today's technology and its impact on the industry, this book would certainly be out of date within a matter of months. That is how quickly this specialized field is evolving. We discussed the LTP's role in greater detail in subsequent chapters, where we look at the effects technology and innovation have on market influencers, the role that technology plays in an LSP's support activities, and how technology can be used to augment the value added through core services. If you currently work for an LTP or dream of bringing together your passions for technology and language one day, then this book may not tell you how to go about doing that. But it does provide invaluable insight into the industry in general and an idea of the buying behaviors of your potential clients, which could range anywhere from CLPs to LSBs.